Question: do you think this is a good deal? Purchase price $369,500. Rent $480. Land size over 850 square meters. The house is a 4-bedroom, 2-bath, double lock-up garage. Now, if you answered yes, it's a good deal, I'm not sure, or maybe, then this episode is for you, because I'm about to show you why that's a horrible deal and what you should do instead if you're looking to invest in property to create a passive income. Hello, it's Nero here, and I recently met a property investor who was really proud of the deal they had found for themselves. Now, whenever someone tells me they found a great deal, I immediately get curious because I want to find out more about it. So let's begin by looking at the numbers on the deal, at least according to this property investor, and then let me break them down for you. So as I said, the purchase price was $369,500. The weekly rent was $480 per week. According to him, this made the deal a positive cash flow deal. He thought it was a great opportunity. He was going to jump all over it. This was essentially the amount of analysis he had done. And what made it even worse was that he said, and this deal has to be positively cash flowed because my wife is pregnant, we're about to have a baby, and so this deal has to pay for itself and give us some extra income to help us while she's on maternity leave. But to me, this is quite a scary proposition because there's a lot more numbers we need to look at. So I then went and dug deeper just for my own peace of mind to work out, well, is this a great deal or not? And what I found out really shocked me. In fact, when I spoke to the real estate agent, he said that yes, he had multiple investors who were calling him from listings on realestate.com.au and buying based on the numbers. Now, the agent himself was happy with this because he was able to sell properties to people who thought they were getting a great deal when there wasn't actually a lot of demand for these properties. But let's begin by looking at the numbers now. So as you can see on this spreadsheet now, I've opened it up to add in everything else we need to look at. So this particular investor shared with me that he's borrowing 80% of the purchase price, gives you a loan of just under $300,000. Now, don't get too caught up in the numbers here. I just want to walk you through the analysis and why I think this particular investor is actually making quite a large mistake. Let's look at the rent, $480 per week. I'll come back to this figure in just a moment, but I would always say that when you're doing your analysis, you need to allow for 2 weeks of vacancy in a year. Maybe there's a change of tenants, maybe it's Christmas time. Anything could happen, right? So when I'm doing my analysis, I look at 50 weeks of rent. So I multiplied 480 by 50 gives me $24,000. This particular investor who I was speaking to said he was taking an interest-only loan and his interest rate was in the low to mid sixes. I'm just going to use 6.5% here as an approximation. So that means he would be paying just over $19,000 per year in interest costs to hold this property. But this is now where you need to go into a bit more detail. This particular property was in a regional location and it was amazing how expensive the rates were. You can see here the rates were actually roughly $3,800 per year. Now remember, the property is only being bought for $369,500, right? So this particular investor is buying in an area where their rates are more expensive than for many people who own $2 million properties in, say, Sydney. Also, because of its regional status, the insurance was quite high, okay, nearly $2,000. Then property management in this particular area was on average about 8.2%. So in total, and I'm not going to include any maintenance here for now, okay, this particular property was going to cost this investor $26,830 per year. Now remember, his income's only 24 grand. Which means he's actually making a loss of $2,832 per year or $236 per month. Now, when I politely try to suggest to this particular investor that this deal that he thought was his great positive cash flow deal was actually going to be somewhat cash flow negative, he said, no, you don't understand. The sales agent told me I can get $550 a week rent and the property is currently under rented, which means the market rent is higher than what the existing tenant is paying. Now, my due diligence didn't suggest that. My due diligence suggested that $480 per week was the approximate rent that he would get. But let's just now change the rent. So instead, we're looking at a rental now of $550 per week. And when I change the rent to be $550 per week, you can see that the property does become positively cash flowed, but only to the tune of $31.75 per month, or approximately $1 per day. Let's say $7 per week. Now, this particular investor is buying this property for positive cash flow in order to be able to build up a passive income. Now, I don't know what his goals are. Let's imagine that he wants to earn a passive income of, say, $50,000 per year, which is $1,000 per week, and he's currently on this particular property making, at best, about $10 per week. That means he's got to go from $10 per week to $1,000 per week on this property if this property is going to help him get there. Of course, he might buy others, but you got to then imagine how many other properties would he have to buy like this to get anywhere near that $1,000 per week positive cash flow. Hopefully you can see this isn't going to work for him. All right. And then he went on to say, oh, but look, it's positive cash flow and there's a national property boom. Property prices are rising everywhere. So this property will rise in value. And that's the first thing to consider. He's actually buying this property for capital growth. He wants a positive cash flow just to hold it, and he's hoping that the positive cash flow will improve over time. But then we need to look at, well, what are the capital growth factors? There is very little demand from owner-occupiers. There's little to no new infrastructure investment going into this particular area. This area is essentially a large mining town, so it's being serviced by one industry, so it's a higher risk investment as well. This essentially does not tick any of the boxes that we'd be looking for if we're trying to help a client buy a property with strong capital growth potential. So by going for positive cash flow, and mind you, there are plenty of other of these sort of what I would call dud opportunities around in 2024 in Australia, where you can buy property that is positive cash flow on day one. The problem is, though, it's going to end up being a disaster, because if you can't get the property continually rented, you're going to get negative cash flow. If you're not going to see that capital growth, you can't then use that property as a stepping stone to buy something else. So what should he do instead? Well, have a look at this particular property that a client of ours bought. She paid $467,300. 12 months later, the property was valued by the bank at $530,000. So that's over a $60,000 increase in capital growth, or over a 13% increase. What's amazing is that over the same time period, the median Australian house price dropped by 5%, and her property, when she bought it, was roughly $100 negative cash flow at the time. 12 months later, because of the increase in rents, the property was essentially $10 negative per month. And with the way rents are going, a year later, this property we positively cash flowed for her. So in 2 years, she would have got capital growth and rental growth. And those are the sorts of properties you need to be buying. You don't start by focusing on properties that give you positive cash flow on day one, at least not in 2024 when interest rates are at the highest they've been at for over a decade. Instead, here's what you need to look at. Number one, look at your own personal cash flow and work out how much surplus cash flow you have, say, every week. Okay, because the odds are that if you're going to buy the right types of property, you will need to be negative cash flow to begin with. Somewhere to the tune of between $150 to say $350 a week, depending on your purchase price, your interest rate, how much cash you're putting into the deal, a few other factors, okay? But it's going to be somewhere in that range, and you first of all need to be clear on what you can afford. Now, if you need to buy property that is positive cash flow from day one, my suggestion is that it might be too risky for you to start investing right now. No matter what anyone else tells you, no matter how good the deal might look on paper, all investing carries risk, and you need to look at the downside. You need to be clear on, well, what happens if, for example, you can't get a tenant for a couple of weeks? Do you have the cash flow to handle that? What happens if there's an unexpected maintenance bill? Do you have the reserves to handle that? If you don't, so if you're redlining yourself, so what I mean by that is you're using all the cash you've saved up, or you're using equity on your house to buy this property, but you really need to make sure the rent covers everything and a little bit more because you don't have any extra income to give to the property, it just might be the wrong time for you to invest. So number one, get clear on how much you can afford on a weekly basis. Then look to find areas where demand is higher than supply, where properties have great scope for capital growth, and the demand, mind you, is coming from owner-occupiers, not primarily investors. You want people moving into this area to actually put down roots and live there long term. Then you want to be looking at, well, what about rental growth? Is there surplus demand from tenants compared to the number of properties available to rent? Because from my perspective, I almost don't care about what the story is about the area or how much property prices might rise or what the infrastructure investment is. If when we look to buy a property for a client, we don't have a strong level of confidence that the property will get rented almost immediately, everything stops. We don't get any further into that area, and I don't think you should either because it's too risky. If you can't get that rental income that you are banking on, your entire property investing strategy goes pear-shaped. So make sure you're clear on the levels of rental demand. Then when you find these areas where demand is higher than supply from owner-occupiers, where there's greater rental demand than available supply of rental properties, couple that with strong infrastructure investment and jobs growth, couple that with strong economic growth in that particular area, plus a few other factors, you now are targeting areas where you can find properties that can give you that capital growth, give you that rental growth over time, so that property that might start off negative, like the client I mentioned earlier on, she ends up being positive in a couple of years. I mean, I have clients who have properties in Sydney that are giving them positive cash flow, but it didn't start out that way, right? They knew it was negative, but they were in there for the longer term because that was the game they were playing. So if you take nothing away from this episode, but you're looking to build a property portfolio that pays you a passive income, focus on buying properties for capital growth and rental growth. Don't go for positive cash flow immediately. Focus on getting positive cash flow eventually. And if you want to know exactly how to go and do that and avoid the kind of mistakes that this particular investor that I mentioned at the start is making, then click the link below to get totally for free the digital version and audio version of my book. It's a full property investing blueprint based on my now 22 years of experience on how you too could build a property portfolio the right way so that you will get that passive income that you're after.